Good morning. Hello. How are you? Can you hear me properly? I'm afraid I cannot hear you. Now I can hear you, I believe.
Okay, we're good.
Excellent. So the reason of this meeting, let's say, is to discuss about the paper, one thing, and second thing, it's about your case, let me see, the case study.
Okay.
I don't know if you have the related document. There are some questions that we need to answer.
Yeah, sure. You lead the question in, and I'll be happy to answer anything you can. I've cleared at least an hour or two from my diary, so we're ready to go.
Excellent. Shall we start with the paper?
Okay.
So the aim is, as I understand from David, is to have two or three projects that you have been involved.
Yeah.
As the findings, and discuss how we can improve the crowd risk analysis and how we can enhance the safety.
Yeah.
You said me three of your projects that you have been involved, but I would like some more information, if I may.
Sure. Ask away.
Excellent. So, do you have the three projects that you have sent me?
No, but I can pull them up on the hard drive at any point.
Excellent. So the one is about the 5k pounds, 15k pounds that you have been involved in Muirfield. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, we have. Sorry, say again.
It's Murrayfield.
Murrayfield.
Yeah.
Yeah, Murrayfield is one of the leading rugby stadiums in the UK. So much the home of Scottish rugby, and Twickenham is the not Twickenham. Might be actually Twickenham. One of the stadiums down south. I'm from Scotland, obviously. Is the home of rugby in England.
Okay.
So what we found was that I'd worked with a variety of little projects in and around Murrayfield and run training courses in Edinburgh for a number of years. So they know me to be an expert in the field. And Murrayfield are typical of the distressed client. So nearly all my clients come to me because they know we've got a degree of expertise and have an urgent problem that they can't quite resolve or figure out for themselves. So we'd often get a call, for instance, late on a Friday night. We've got an event going on Monday morning. Can you come and have a look? We're just not comfortable. So in the Murrayfield instance, they said they're quite happy that their safety processes and procedures are to code, to specification, but he wanted a mystery shopper, somebody to go along and just check on it. The reason is that they'd had two minor injuries on site, and they'd planned to do some development to a location at the corner of the site, which was going to change the way in which the merchandising was to be laid out. So whenever you do a big change like that on a site, they don't know what the consequences might be. And that's really what we model and predict. How are crowds going to adapt and move in a new environment? So the project had two threads to it. One was just review existing safety procedures. Are they okay? And secondly, can we advise on what will happen when they change the merchandising area? So that's what I'd call the level one project. The client that can't quite put his finger on his problem requires what we call a reverse brief. This is a client who will often say, I've just got a gut feel that it's not quite right, but I can't quantify it. So I go in with a range of tools, quantify it, analyze it, and then give a set of recommendations. So in Murrayfield's instance, it involved a call on the Thursday. Can we come and see the match on the Saturday? So again, a client who's only got one real event left of that season has finally managed to get his budget. Now he needs the cavalry to come in and help him out. So there was no D at MMU that was available, so my daughter and I went. She works for me. So we went up to Murrayfield, we did a site survey, and that basically consists of walking around pre-event. So we're looking at queuing on the way in. We sit and discuss with the safety and operations team. We look at CCD camera positioning. We get a hold of all of the documentation, which, if there were to be an incident, is the sort of information that prosecution would need. So we gathered all of the information, the data, etc., spent a day on the site as a customer, walking the various areas, setting up cameras, videoing extensively ingress, circulation, and egress. So we're just data gathering at that point. It came quickly to the conclusion that they actually did have a significant risk on their site. So our recommendation was that they are in breach of a number of their own risk assessment codes, and that if there were to be an accident, which we illustrated by creating a Mr. Fictitious has had a serious slip and cracked his head against the concrete in this particular corner, which was a high risk of trip, slips and falls. And this is what an expert witness report would look like. So highlighted all of their deficiencies in their current practices and procedures as if it were part of a prosecution case. So the beauty with that is that they got an enormous amount of benefit out of having an expert who does a lot of legal work review their safety risk assessment policies. Now, I would say 90% of what they're doing is right, but it's never the 90% you get prosecuted for. The 10% that they were deficient in was the bulk of our report and analysis. Then, of course, we looked at the review of their merchandising and identified for them that they were really adopting the policy of who pays the most gets the best pitch. So the best area for locating facilities.
Yeah.
And you know from operations research, optimizing, say, like a factory layout or the movement of people to merchandising stalls. So there were a lot of large merchandising outlets. Guinness, for instance, had a particular stand that were not positioned optimally. And by optimal, we tend to look at, as patrons discharge from the stadium, all the merchandising is outside. Then accessibility, types of queuing system. They had very, very long snaked queuing systems that people had to walk through for several minutes when there was no one in it. So things like managing the queuing system, making it more efficient, more accessible for patrons, looking at the turnover and profitability of each stand. So they've got a very low profitability stand, which is prime pitch, simply because they think they're paying a lot of money for it. But really, that shouldn't be in a position where it's got a high footfall. It needs to be visible, but not on the beaten track. So things like that, where we look at visibility analysis, where we look at footfall, where we look at the profit of each stand merchandising stall, and the fact that there's such a high variety event to event. Different events attract different types of concession stands, so that it's never fixed. So we produced for them, if you like, a mapping process, which again is straight out of operations research. You're laying out a factory floor, you want to have an optimal throughput. Here it's the people that we're optimizing around rather than our final product.
Okay.
So they got those two things for it, and that I think was... I have to check my notes. I think it might have been a £10,000 or a £15,000 project. So a lot of value for it, which involved a site study, the two of us going up there on a match day, getting a feel for it, and using, if you like, 30 years of watching crowds to realise what's the best way to lay out that particular site. Now, obviously, there's an opportunity in that, namely that there are a whole range of clubs and sporting venues that could be open to prosecution and would like to know what their risk exposure is. So one of the things that we're looking at in the department is, could we start marketing that as a service? We'll come and do a litmus test of your risk assessment to see whether or not you are as robust as you think you are, and give you the benefit of what happens in a case is that it's never the risk over here that you prosecute on. This is an accident. It's the risk that they've neglected over there that gives you indicative failures. So we may not actually have evidence of the accident, but we've got evidence around the site of how they are not complying with their own risk assessment policy. And that's because the documentation is so poor, it's never read. And again, it's a classic case of it's a statutory requirement to do a risk assessment. But what we often find is that they are just cutting and pasting from previous sections, never reading it, never really implementing it. So in essence, that's your kind of £10,000, £15,000 project. An uncomfortable client can't put his fingers on things. You can often do those remotely because you can just study CCTV footage, or they'll ask you to do a site survey, and it really just depends on availability as to whether you can get to that site, or one of our students can maybe go and do the site survey action. So I give people a list of things to look out for, photographs to take, and again, 30 years of doing this gives us an insight into organizational failures, areas of improvement. So it's a fairly similar to any MRP, manufacturing resource planning process, is that you go in with a knowledge of manufacturing and resource planning, and you look to see what they're doing compared to what others do, and you can do compare and contrast.
Okay.
So that in essence is the low-end project.
Excellent. So if I can create a table that it will have the name of the project, the duration would be 1 day, you said?
1 day on site and about 10 days to do the report and analysis. Inevitably, that results in either a client presentation. So what I tend to do is a movie file of me talking over a PowerPoint slide, so that then they've got something tangible that when it's convenient to them, they can take it to the CEO, and it's as if I'm in the room. Often or not, the CEO, the chairman of the operation or operations directors, they'll control the budgets. We work with a tier below that, the safety engineers. So it's never easy to get into the CEO unless they call me directly and say, we've got a problem. So often it's more convenient for us to give them the materials that then they can present as part of their ongoing safety operations. We found that to be a very happy medium in a lot of the cases that we're working with.
Excellent. So again, we might say 10 days or...
About 10 days, although I think the project took about 3 months. It was only 10 man days of time. The other time was client has so many events on. It's a busy season for them that they've got all of the files. They haven't yet looked at them. They haven't given a final sign-off. So it can be instant in many cases, and sometimes you work with a client and they may ask for a little bit more. And it's just a question of client management as to when you want to invoice and when you want to phase invoice it. But usually it's between 5 and 10 man days of effort to do those 10 to 15,000 pound projects. Think of it on the scale of it's about £1,500 per day is our charge rate.
Okay, but as a whole project, then it's 3 months, that we'll say.
Yeah, but you're not just doing Murrayfield. You've got about 1,000 other things on at the same time.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I should have offered you a coffee.
No, that's fine. Just to write something on the paper, let's say 3 months then.
That's start to finish, but it's only 10 man days of work.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But as the starting point, the finishing point of the project...
It can be. I mean, Derry Maurice, for instance, the guy that we've been dealing with, he's been talking about it for a couple of years. He's been trying to get the budget for several months. He finally gets the go-ahead on the Thursday, and can we come up on the Saturday? So that's the very short time frame between can we do and can we deliver. Too fast, in fact, the MMU cannot respond to that. So I can't even get a discussion with contract people in that space of time. And we don't know we've got the contract until the client actually says, yes, go. Then there may well be a time of pre-analysis and checking, but literally, I would say it's about 10 man days of effort goes into it. But the lead time can be prior to you getting the purchase order, a couple of years, and then it might be before you actually finally invoice it, a couple of months. But we remain as flexible as our clients are. Mm-hmm. The thing is, of course, in parallel, I look at about 60 or 7 case studies a year. I teach over 1,000 people a year, and all of those are potential clients. The only reason they come on the courses is because they've got problems.
Okay.
So when I go out and teach short courses, they tell me their problems. Mm-hmm. I take note of it, and then maybe 6 months from now, I'll get a phone call from somebody that remembers me from a course.
I see.
Hey, you're the guy that solves this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, when I teach, I show them all the problems that we've solved.
Yeah.
So it's a self-perpetuating marketing strategy that we developed early on. Is that so long as I'm teaching as a level of expertise, then the clients get to know that if they have a problem with people that are out there to fix it and sort it.
Okay, excellent. And if we go back to the specific project that we discussed at the moment.
Murrayfield, yeah.
Yeah. Could you describe the aim? You described it as in a sense, for example. What would you say?
Yeah, I think the aim here is to allay the customer's undocumented fears. So the customer has an uncomfortable feeling that they are exposed to an unknown risk, mm-hmm. That they think they're doing things well, but they're uncertain as to how well they are compared to other stadia and standards. And I think the one phrase that they wanted from me was to say, you pass, yes, this is good. Okay. Another interesting sideline from it is that having written a report, if they then follow recommendations, if there is an accident, I'm conflicted for being expert witness for the prosecution. I would have to defend that. Mm-hmm. So as an insurance policy, knowing that I get involved in a lot of the litigation cases, I'm automatically on their side because they've contracted me to advise on safety. So there's an interesting little political element to it, but generally it's a distressed client that requires a reverse brief. I don't know what's wrong. I'm feeling uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Can you help quantify it or qualify it at least?
Okay, so they want to improve the operations or the service that they offer.
Yeah, and I think it's generally people that are involved in the operations side of things. We deal with 3 levels: operational, tactical, and strategic. So at the bottom level, it's the operations people that call us that have got minimal tight budgets, but require an expert's name on a report that says that they're doing okay, or if there is something that they need to fix, then how do we fix it? What is it? So it's always the reverse brief at that level. Mm-hmm.
So what was the problem? They didn't know what was the problem, but after your investigation...
One of the problems was that they had an area which was narrow, which had a lot of footfall, and because there's a lot of footfall, the merchandising look at that as being highly profitable. It's not the case. Sometimes positioning things so that you can maintain a steady flow of people to the servers. So this is all about basically queuing and serving. They believe that high footfall means more customers. That's not true. Mm-hmm. They had an area which is a high footfall. It was a concern. He keeps looking at it and he keeps telling me, I'm really worried about the west corner. So I reviewed it, I studied it, I was there filming it at the end, and yes, it's tight, but in terms of a risk, it's no more than 60% on a scale of 1 to 100. What we did tell them was the problem is that their operators move waste disposal units into that area, making it even narrower, and that we've got video of mobility impaired and children actually having to navigate through the bins.
Yeah.
So in their risk assessment process, it said that they will not put anything in the way of people in areas of high footfall, and clearly they're in breach of that. So that then gave him the information to go back to the CEO and said, we need to move these tents about 20 feet away from that area, and we need to do waste management properly. That was one of his primary concerns, was specifically the west corner. His other concern was he doesn't know what's going to happen when they put this new building in place. How's it going to change the dynamic? That wasn't an issue, but it would upset all of the merchandising because it changes the routing for footfall for moving in and out the stadium and merchandising areas. And his third concern was, where are we compared to other stadia? How well are we doing our safety? And that was answered from the fact that we created this fictitious accident, advised on how you might get prosecuted, and that really put the fear of death into them as to what they need to improve. I would say it would have been damning if there was a fatality, but now that they can look at it and address it, it's not going to be a large cost to fix, to put right, but they just didn't know what it was wrong. So again, the reverse brief, we're feeling uncomfortable, we can't put our finger on it. Can you help? Can you put your expert eye on this and tell us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong?
So what was the solution?
The solution was to tighten up on the risk assessment processes, to increase the width of the West End area where they had the tight footfall, to put a barrier around the slope by the clock tower, which we went there when it was raining, and I saw somebody slip and fall and nearly fall head first against a set of concrete steps. That needs a barrier around it to prevent that from happening. And also advice on, as they are building this new section to the stadium, it's a sporting ground, I think it's a set of squash courts to the northwest. Then the biggest problem will be that during the construction phase, the construction engineers are going to want a lot more space than you think. What he had was the footprint of the new building, but the construction hoarding around that is going to maybe take up about 3/4 more concourse than he'd thought. So he's going to be left with a very small concourse during the construction phase, and advised him that the best thing to do during that process was to engage us to work with the construction engineers to tell them what corridors they need to leave clear, which is exactly what we did with Manchester City. They were building a new part of the stadium. They still need to keep the stadium operating, but they've got cranes, construction equipment in transit. And I think, to give you an example of why that's such a fluid situation, I had 7 plan modifications on one afternoon that changed the footprint completely, because as they were moving a crane in, they realised that it wasn't the crane that they wanted. They had to get another one and a bigger footprint, and that changed the barrier hoarding around the outside. And they kept sending another plan, then another plan, then another plan, as I typically see. And I turned it around to them and said, look, you've got to keep this width clear. I don't care how you do it, you've got to keep that width clear. So we laid down rules for the construction engineers. And that really is when we get into the next level of project, is when we're designing things. So at the bottom tier is just report and analysis, basically. Maybe a site survey, but certainly it's report and analysis. The next tier up is where a client has an issue and he wants me to design something for him. Okay?
Excellent. And the benefit for the company?
Well, the benefit was, of course, the peace of mind of knowing that 90% of what they were doing was great, and that we were able to identify those areas that they had were unconsciously aware of, or rather consciously aware of, but couldn't articulate. So going into the site and saying, yeah, I can put my finger on, this is how you need to change your documentation, this is how you should improve your site, your operations. But 90% of it, I would say, was at gold standard. And the reason they call me in is because they're concerned more about the 10% that could be improved than the 90% that they're already doing right.
Excellent. So they had customer satisfaction, they improved the customer satisfaction then, I assume. Did they have any financial benefit?
Well, safety never creates profit. It's more like an insurance policy. So that if I've got a client who says, I don't have the budget for safety, then I always advise them, you're not paying for safety. You're paying for what happens if you don't have a safety policy in place. So his concern was that as the in-house safety officer, his CEO was always at loggerheads with him about budget. But when you pull in an external expert, and the external expert says this is what you need to put right, then the CEO does tend to take that more into account than what is... I didn't say very much more than Derry had already told him, but because it comes from an external expert with a huge amount of authority and reputation in the industry, then of course the CEO tends to notice that a little bit more. And that was one of the things that the client wanted, was just my name on a report will make it far more credible. It will make it easier for the CEO to sign off on something because he's got the external reference to draw on rather than just his own internal guy who seems to be bleating on about the same thing year after year. So you'll often find that in consultancy is that you're really just gathering all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle and showing them what's in front of their eyes in the first place. But it's articulating it, it's demonstrating it, it's explaining it in a simpler form that really we've specialised in. All of the tools really are highly visual so that when people look at it, they get a clearer idea. Now, the net result was that both of the safety officers joined the short course. They're looking to getting an MSc in this, and they're looking how to improve their knowledge and understanding of doing what I did when I went on site.
Very good. Did you use any tools that you have created on this project? For example, the DIM ICE analysis?
Yes, our reports generally feature that with a little bit of background and information, which of course was what is this? Join the APEL course. And we did the risk and congestion mapping. So we showed them and demonstrated areas that could be improved. Also applied things like queuing theory. One of the issues that they had was that the early arrivals used the nearest turnstiles. And as a result, when the bulk of the customers arrive, those nearest turnstiles get overwhelmed and people can't get past the queue to further away turnstiles. So manage the queue. Again, that's just one of the tools that we tend to demonstrate is how to use design information and management on a queuing system to create a more efficient inflow. And we demonstrated that in 3 of their key areas for ingress, which will make an immediate improvement. The improvement you get from that is that the quicker you get them through the turnstiles, then the less frustrated they are. So it's a behavioural enhancement. But also the quicker you get them into the stadium, the more they spend at the merchandising stalls, the longer the dwell time in the areas where there's food and beverage for sale, well, particularly alcohol.
Excellent. So we have a second project, and we will have a similar discussion on that. Is about Olympics project.
Okay.
So you said it's about 15k pounds to 50k.
Yeah, we did a couple of those now. For Beijing was to look with, I think it was Arab that did the engineering. This was the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing for the Beijing Olympics. One of the key issues they had is nobody had designed egress and ingress staircases to that specification before. And if we were to model and simulate egress, in fact, I recall there was a television program comparing the Beijing Stadium to the Colosseum in Rome as to which had the better ingress egress. And of course the Colosseum was designed using the geometric principles that we currently apply, whereas the Beijing Stadium wasn't.
Yeah.
So back in the Greece and Roman times, they understood crowd flow from a purely geometric perspective, which is fascinating if you look at the history of it. For instance, in Pompeii, all 30,000 of the entire walled city could go to the stadium.
Yeah.
And ingress and egress, because it were all outdoor toilets, was designed around crowd flow. It's inherently obvious when you look at it, but we seem to have forgotten those principles when we shoehorn stadium into busy city centres. So looking at queuing, looking at ingress and egress, that was the project, and it was with the design engineers to apply, this is Beijing, so I forget which year it was, apply the modelling and principles to the site. The other project, Olympic, was Sydney Olympics, which was designing a command and control tool, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet that had all of the event start times, train schedules, end times, and popularity in a spreadsheet. So it was really just looking at where they might see pedestrians on their concourse area, their what they call the common domain. Mm-hmm. So the areas between the venues and events. So you look at the popularity of the events, you look at the number of tickets that are sold, you've got a big spreadsheet that sits behind all of that, and the output from your spreadsheet is to basically look at the number of people that would be in circulation rather than in the stadiums. Mm-hmm. So they're moving between events. Now, of course, there's a lot of approximation built into that. Yeah. But two things that come out of it is, one is to advise patrons when to leave places like Sydney and outlying areas, because you've got your transit times, you've got your transit capacity, you've got your queuing times for security and screening, you've got your walk time to get to the stadium, and your seating time. Mm-hmm. So those 5 elements we then estimated. We knew it would take at least 2 hours to get from Sydney into your seat. But of course, how people respond to that time frame, if you tell them it's going to take 2 hours, then they're all going to leave 2 hours before the event. And the system will not cope with that demand. We need to somehow create a more Poisson distribution or skewed distribution along their arrival times. So we basically misinform. We say it'll take at least 4 hours to get to your seat. Okay. So that people arrive early. There's plenty to do in the concessions and the attraction in the common domain spaces. So they're never disappointed, but we can get them all in on time. And quite a lot of our scheduling, we may work out from operations research the optimal time to get people through the system, but knowing that we need to have a distribution over time, how do we schedule that, and how do we program their behavior to take that into account? And one of the big difficulties we often see is that mind doesn't respond the same way as a factory production worker. Mm-hmm. So if you're dealing with members of the public, you've got to understand how they process information, and that's the other end of the equation, is how do we influence behavior. So there's a fascinating element that overlaps between where we apply operations research techniques for scheduling things like trains, transport, queuing, security, travel distance, etc., and then how we inform people to make sure that they don't have a high queue. The Poisson distribution isn't very narrow. We need to distribute the Poisson distribution as far as possible. So that can involve in scheduling elements of people that come to various events. Sometimes we can't work with the schedule. We've got to work with what we've got. But often, if we could change the schedule, we could design it around people flow. So there are elements where we are looking at both design, information, and management of queuing systems to that scale. So what that ended up with was, in the control room, they had the Excel data, and it was just merely changing the colors on a large map. Yeah. So they could see when they were expecting high density. They had live cameras, so we've got the model saying this is your expectation. They've got the live camera of what's happening, and if there's a difference between the two, instantly the red flag. That's what we're expecting, that's what we're seeing. It's not as we're expecting, what's going wrong. So it was a dynamic visual method of people being able to just track their expectations. Mm-hmm. We did the same with the fill predictor for London New Year, for Chelsea Flower Show. A lot of major events, and our master students are applying the same sort of techniques to their events. And again, those are your £15,000 to £50,000 projects where you're designing either a control room system or doing some aspect of major site analysis for complex events. Okay.
If we focus on the Olympics project in Sydney, as you mentioned, Again, if we go back to my table, what was the duration? Do you remember of the project?
It was about 6 months for that one.
6 months. And when was that?
1999, of course, it was the 2000 Olympics. So it was 6 to 8 months before the event kicked off that they realised. What often happens in Olympic events is because there's a great deal of nationalistic pride, they don't hire in a professional team. They create them internally for people that have got no Olympic experience. Mm-hmm. So this was a question where their team had realised they've got some significant challenges and didn't have the in-house skills to deal with it. So I was called in, I flew down to Sydney, did a number of presentations, and we built the system. I designed the Excel spreadsheets and loaded all the data, and a guy called John Webster did the graphics front end.
Okay.
So the system went into place. It was in the control room. It ran for a fortnight, and I still go down to Australia, still lecture on it. Many people that I've talked to were there in the control room using it, saying we didn't realise how easy it was to build something like that. It was just beyond their skill set at the time. So again, 6 month duration. I think it was something like 3 weeks solid work just building the spreadsheet, run the game schedule, and that's just looking at when the event starts. People have got to get there. How long is that going to take? So it's just like a big Gantt chart, basically. So you'll obviously understand what that means. So once you've got that level of data, then what's not in the stadium is walking around the public domain. The other key element that came out from it is they didn't know how many... there's a thing called NETs, non-event ticketing spectators. People that just come and walk around but don't have a ticket for anything.
Yeah.
So they just want to be part of the Olympic atmosphere. So they'll go and visit all the attractions and all the exhibits and see the Olympic flame and take the photographs. Now, knowing how many people you've got in the common domain, knowing what its capacity is at any point in time, gives you an idea of how many non-event ticketing spectators you can allow. So these are people that are just there to add to the crowd. And there are certain peak days where you don't allow nets on the site. So you've got to work out when you've got capacity to allow the non-event ticketing spectators who may be on there for 8 to 10 hours. So working out the dwell time, working out the latency, working out how many people will have an uptake of the tickets. Those are kind of the hard maths applied to these kind of problems, which is the same kind of problem you would deal with a railway station and dwell times and platform capacities, with concourses, with an interface between a transport system and a stadium. It's all about the dwell time, and whenever marketing people see a space with a lot of crowds in it, they think, merchandising opportunity, and they start to erode the space and change the dynamics by putting in more and more merchandising stalls without realizing that many of these places can only function as throughput. You can't have dwell time in, you imagine if you've got a platform in London Underground and you start to put merchandising in there, you would completely destroy its functionality. So we tend to get involved in a lot of projects where things have been added and all of a sudden they're not working anymore. So Hong Kong Jockey Club, for instance, was working fine for many years, and then all of a sudden, a lot of complaints. We get a call in there, we go along and investigate and say, that's the location of this merchandising. If you move it over there, problem solved. And they can't see the combination of queuing, how the queue interferes with the crowd dynamics. And the reason they can't see that is because during an operation, they're too busy dealing with on the ground to have an overview or have the tools to analyse it. So Sydney Olympics, a lot of the major events, merchandising, concourse plans, layouts, etc. That's your £15,000 to £50,000 project.
Okay, and if you can describe the aim within a sentence, so what was the aim?
Optimization. Yes.
Optimization, yeah.
Optimizing. Nearly everything that we deal is optimizing cost, efficiency, throughput. Although some of those might be opaque to the customer, they might not actually understand that what you're doing is a cost optimization problem. they'll feel in terms of it's an unquantifiable gut feel about risk that they're dealing with. I'll look at it in terms of optimizing throughput. But you use the client's language. If the client's, like Murrayfield, he was losing sleep over what he thought was a significant risk. So by quantifying it to him and saying, no, this is a throughput problem, this is your risk, it's over here, he's able to then rest easier because he's got a clear definition of something that he's been so busy working at, he can't see it anymore. There's a phrase in English, you can't see the wood for the trees.
Okay.
So he's too busy dealing with the trees to actually step back from the problem and see what's happening. And most of the people that work in operations are like that. They've grown up through the industry, they've worked up through the ranks, and have never had the analytical tools to be able to step back from a problem and assess it for what it really is. And that's really where our skill set comes in, is to be able to put it into play and to quantify, to use operations research techniques to basically optimize throughput, minimize cost impact, minimize exposure to risk. So it's a multidimensional, like any OR project. You look at a factory floor, a layout, and you do it applying exactly the same tools and techniques. That's where my background came from, and that's really what we're applying into these spaces.
Excellent. And back to the project, how did they describe the problem? Why did they call you?
They called me because they'd heard that there was this guy in the world that could solve crowd problems. And he showed me a plan of the common domain, and the architect had given him three alternatives. One was multiple bridges to try and separate crowd flow. One was just a free-for-all where people could go whenever they want, which they felt might be severely congested. Another one just had a one-way system. And I looked at the problem and I went, it's an application of an Euler tour. I mean, really, your one-way system allows you to create a one-way optimized movement, and a Steiner shortest spanning tree. And he went, what? And I said, well, an Euler tour bridges the Königsberg problem was to look at your origins and destinations and to try and create a network that would allow to optimize the flow. Sometimes by adding an extra node, you can create a more efficient space, which is the Steiner shortest spanning tree mathematical solution to network analysis. By adding an additional node, I can create a more efficient system. So these two sit hand in hand, but I'm talking a mathematics language. So here, and they're kind of say, well, that's me. So I ended up then just sketching it for them, and they went, okay, right, you've got a job. Come down and design it for us. So I think there were several projects involved. One of them was the control room system. Another one, I think, was about 150,000, was actually the design of the north and south rotary systems for the common domain. And that was just using differential spaces. So again, that's where your design element comes into place. And I've got my original sketches, and of course the people that worked the Olympics said that's exactly what we put into place. Because nobody knew how to do these kind of things at the time. The number of clients that call me, I still don't think there's a lot of people in the world that know how to optimize throughput. But it's the sort of stuff that people in operations research do all the time. It's factory planning, it's layout for MRP processes. It's nothing different to thinking about moving people rather than moving product. Of course there are layers of setting expectations, of having signage and information, of making a pleasant environment. We're not just treating them like moving boxes through a factory. But fundamentally, it is just MRP, manufacturer resource planning, on those sort of scales.
Okay. And what type of models did you use? What type of tools?
Well, it was looking at the bridges of Königsberg problem. It was network analysis. So there was a lot of network theory applied to it. There was the mathematics of Steiner shortest spanning tree. When you look at spanning trees, you're looking at origins and destinations, routes in between. So it was mostly network analysis for that one. So again, solid mathematics. Once you work in a network theorem, then applying the flows on top of that determines how wide the road should be. So I know my network, I know how it's connected, I know how to create a one-way system with all of these possible options by introducing additional nodes. I now need to put barriers around those routes, and I need to work out how wide they should be. And I demonstrate in a class how if you've got the basics of network theorem, you can work out something that actually the client paid £100,000 to have simulations run, and it gave the same answer that you can produce just by using some simple techniques.
Okay.
You know what the demand is at the highest point of the system? So we've got 40,000 coming across the bridge, 30,000 through the train station, and another 10,000 coming through the pavilion. 80,000 per hour is the maximum that this point of the system is going to see. So I need to make it wide enough for that. I know that optimally people will move at 82 people per meter per minute. So 80,000 divided by 60 to get it into minutes, divided by 82 tells me the width, 16.25, and I add 20% as my margin for error. So 20 meter wide roads, and that's it. So, however, you've then got to apply that to each node and each junction in the system. What I've done is I worked out what the worst case is. I realized that I can make all the roads 20 meters wide, and they're never going to reach their peak demand. They're only ever going to get up to 80% of its capacity. In other words, we're designing resilience into the system. You're probably very aware that whenever any operation system gets above the 80% utilization rate, it becomes brittle. So with crowds, we just try to keep it. You know, you're never using more than 80% of its capacity. So simple stuff, but it's complex rather than complicated. It's not complicated to do the maths. It's complex because there are lots of little parts you need to apply it to, and you need to understand how the whole thing meshes together in network theorem. So there's a chunk of mathematical creativity that comes in there, of knowing the core mathematical tools, but really it's fairly simplistic principles. And that's what I teach. Here are the principles. And this is why the clients then come to us. Yeah, we understand that, but we don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
We don't have that skill set of handling all of the pieces in our heads. So that's really where we get the calls from distressed clients. Like, we know that we got a problem, we don't know how to fix it, but we know that you know how to fix it. So can you come and help us out?
Okay, excellent. Excuse me, Keith, if we go back to the first project, what was the year of the project? Do you remember?
Murrayfield?
Yeah.
It was last November.
Last November.
So less than a year ago. 11 months? 10 months ago.
Okay. Then we have another one. The Canary Wharf analysis you used there, the Saudi government that you will be involved.
Yeah.
You said that it was...
Okay, oh, they were fantastic.
Sorry?
Right, well, let's take Canary Wharf first.
Yeah.
That, again, was people that have been on my courses saying that we've got a problem. This was 2003.
2003.
So 2 years after 9/11. Canary Wharf is a major financial district in the UK. And they had lived through the height of the IRA bombing. So they have security for vehicle incursion, and they had automatic number plate recognition around all of London. So getting a vehicle from Ireland into London, it's tracked port to port. So there's no secrets there. Getting vehicles that are laden with explosives to disrupt infrastructure was the aim of the IRA during the height of the Troubles. Now, of course, having designed systems for that, they were completely caught off guard because nobody had thought about flying an aircraft in, you know, to hijack the aircraft. So there was a huge, oh my God, the world has changed. These people are not like the IRA, where you would get a 3-minute coded warning. You could create an orderly evacuation of a building. All they wanted to do was destroy the infrastructure, destroy the buildings. They didn't want to kill people. Yeah. That, to the extent of attacking London. It was bad politics to kill people, because you never know how elderly women and children might get involved in that. And you know how emotive it gets. I can see you've got some, obviously you've got some small children with you.
I have a daughter, yes. She's at the nursery at the moment.
Sorry, how many kids have you got?
I have a daughter. She's at the nursery at the moment.
Okay, so you know how emotive that gets. Yeah. And to blow something up from the IRA's perspective is bad politics when children are involved. So they were very targeted, quite gentlemanly as far as bombing was concerned. And so all of their infrastructure was built around this. Mm-hmm. But then the world changed. We suddenly had the Middle East ISIS terrorists who would give no warning and were suicide bombers and would blow themselves up in crowds, and aircraft being flown into sites. So what Canary Wharf were getting was two credible threats per week, where the police, when a member of the public or the police or Canary Wharf management would understand there's a credible threat. Now, what do they do about it? Mm-hmm. The police don't have official or legal authority to call an evacuation unless there's an imminent risk to life and limb.
Okay.
A threat isn't an imminent risk. It's a perceived threat. It's a warning. We don't know what's happening. The game's changed. So if they tell somebody like Barclays Bank to evacuate and it's a false alarm, then they could be liable for financial losses. So a serious issue there was that they wanted a top-down command and control structure. Yeah. They couldn't force an evacuation because of the potential of if it were a false alarm, and they didn't know how to quantify the alarms at the time. And also Canary Wharf management didn't have that authority. What they wanted was a bottom-up instruction set, so that a building could then self-evacuate. But if the HSBC building safety officer says we need to evacuate, then it's their liabilities, it's not the police liability. Mm-hmm. So it was a cost problem, is that how do we get the information to propagate through the system by minimizing also this potential risk of litigation. So the police gave us a call and said, here's our issue. We don't know how to solve this, but we basically say there's a threat. We tell Canary Wharf management. Canary Wharf management then tell the building. The building then may or may not call an evacuation. And the first thing we know is that the members of the public are now calling the police saying, what do we do? What's happening? Mm-hmm. So we're caught in an information loop when we should be dealing with a crisis. So we need to break that information loop. We want to issue one single top-down command that propagates through the system, and then nobody comes back on us for it. So that was their problem. That's not how they articulated it. They articulated the point of view is that we cannot break this deadlock of members of the public calling us and saying, help, we're out in the streets, what's happening? Mm-hmm. So we need to kind of cut that out with the system completely. And this was the solution we came up with, was a tool that I think Simon called Chorus for some reason. We wanted everybody to sing from the same hymn sheet. Mm-hmm. Terrible pun. But basically, the tool was to mark the entire site with coordinated grids. So 1 to 30, A to Z. And you then identify just the location of the threat by a grid reference. Mm-hmm. So it might be B17. Then the severity of the threat identified by a radius. So B17, and we've got small parcel bombs get 100 meters away, a larger parcel bomb 200 meters away, and a vehicle encased device 400 meters away. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem with Canary Wharf was that it's an island surrounded by water with very few exit points. Yeah. So depending on the position of the threat meant you needed to direct the people away from the site, away from the threat. So they needed to get directional information from that. And again, that's fundamentally a network analysis. Mm-hmm. Look at the capacity of all the existing roads, look at the location of the threat, and then just do a little bit of background calculation to work out if I need to evacuate the buildings in the area of the threat, and I've only got these roads available because my threat's here, so I can only use the roads across here. Mm-hmm. I need to push everybody that way. What's the capacity? Which route should they take? Yeah. So basically, everybody would be given a coded warning. So location of the threat, severity of the threat. That's it. Just that small packet of information. And they all had on their desktops, laptops, the grid references and a hard-coded network. So that they would press the location of the threat, they'd click on their building, and it would flash up just the positions of the network that were viable to get that crowd off of those streets in that direction. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, that if you've got multiple buildings involved, we had a lookup table of all of the options.
Yes.
Which wasn't really that extensive, but a very simple lookup table that we could pre-test and configure so that the police then knew which routes they had capacity to take emergency response vehicles in, that everybody knew the location of the threat, and it was completely top-down, because the rule that we imposed for behavioural modification was that you follow the marshals and you keep going, and then we only need to train the marshals to get off the site.
Yeah.
So, and on July the 7th in 2005, 2 years after the system was in, of course we had the London bombing. The entire London Underground was shut down. It had started off as a train derailed, and then 2 trains had collided, then a power station had blown up, and then it was, they'd realised there were 3 trains that had been bombed, and then a bus was bombed, and then within half an hour that had escalated to London is under siege and the entire network shut down. So we need to now move people off the site on foot.
Yes.
And we got the video of the guy with the flags. I don't think I've got it anymore because it's on VHS. Walking off the site with a flag and everybody following them. It was like follow the leader. So we changed it from normally if you're in a building they say you get out of the building and you leave and then wonder what you're doing next. Here we said instead of the marshal pushing people, the marshal leads them. And everybody's got the rule, you follow the marshals, you follow the crowd, you keep going. So that was a behavioural element to a network analysis of the site. But then the contract was to maintain it because the site was under development, it was being built. So again, coupling that with construction changes, accessibility and routes that from week to week would change in capacity meant that we needed a method of getting out information about what routes are viable today and to train everybody on the site. So 90,000 copies of the software went out, 50,000 copies of the software went out to 90,000 employees and occupants of the site. And every Monday morning, they'd get the coded message, they'd click on the computer, they'd work out what route they'd need to take, and then we had prepared a bunch of videos to show them what it would look like. So they never needed to leave their desk to get effectively up-to-the-minute training of how the site was developing. Now, Simon Ancliffe and I were working on that. Simon left to take that contract up full-time and used all of that funds to start an organisation called Movement Strategies. So I built the software. Simon then maintained the contract, which was worth about $130,000 a year to maintain that software during the construction phases. I think it's evolved since then, but that's your $150,000 problem-solving project.
Okay, excellent.
So network analysis, working out, and then keeping it updated because the site was under constant construction.
So those data that you provide me at the moment, I am going to use them as the findings section of our paper. So I'm struggling a bit with the methodology, and I would like your advice on that. In my mind, I had that I'm going to use the DIM ICE analysis as a common analysis that you use to all of the projects, but is that true or not?
We have a suite of tools, DIM ICE, risk and congestion mapping, decision support tools. Those are, if you want, the operators' tools, the ones that are easy to pass on. Your up to your £50,000 projects, those are your core tools. Your £50,000 to £150,000 projects, you're getting into simulation network analysis, much more complicated mathematical constructs where you're dealing with a multi-dimensional problem, and that's not something that we can readily teach. We do teach how to build the equivalent of a Canary Wharf project, which is an evacuation analysis. You build a network, you can lay your network out on a spreadsheet, you can put an overlay on your spreadsheet of a circle that's got a radius, you can send out the coded messaging information. All of that is fairly straightforward, but that's our last unit we teach in the MSc. So network analysis, working out the capacity of your network, applying some optimization problems along that, doing some routing analysis onto it. That's your higher skill set, if you like.
So
everything else is using the core tools. So up to about your £50,000 projects, it's dim ice, ramp analysis, it's the basics.
Okay.
And the only thing you're charging there for is the complexity of the site, the amount of data you're processing. When you're into your £50,000 to £150,000 projects, you really are stretching more into network analysis, field predictors, using statistical analysis to gather data of crowd movement to project when an area would be full, for instance. So you're using a higher mathematical skill set for the higher end projects. Rightly so. That's why you charge the big bucks.
Yeah, of course. Which at the moment we cannot describe them in our paper. So if we keep the DIMICE model, would you be happy with that and describe how you start? And then, of course, we can say that there are modeling tools that we will use.
I think that's perfectly true. And every project, and the reason DIMICE, the word here sounds like the English word demise, death, to die.
Okay.
Demise was contrived to fit there. Took me months to try and figure out how to make an acronym that would stick, because like everything else, it has to have resonance.
Yes.
It has to have a feel for it. So DIMICE is the primary tool, which was based on analysis of accidents. So what was your common legal definition of causality? Design failure, information failure, or management failure. So if you look at something like, or even the Titanic, design, information, and management are the failure modes. And what's interesting, of course, is that with a 3-axis system, I could create a surface, a topography, which is a catastrophe curve, which again, I teach only in Unit 3 in the second year of the MSc. Just to look at the surface of a DIMICE model as a 3-axis model, design, information, and management on 3 axes, then gives a perspective of how to push a system away from a catastrophe, a cusp catastrophe. But forgetting that for a moment, DIMICE really is a tool that every project starts with that. What are my design constraints? So my network is a design constraint. My width of a road is a design constraint. The number of turnstiles, the interface between a stadium and a transport system, that's my design constraints.
Yes.
Then information systems sit on top of that, is how to use and understand it. So how does a person know to go to a particular turnstile or use a particular tube station? How do we inform the public for the time it takes them to get there? How do we program, if you want, the users? How do we inform them, whether it's PA announcement systems on site, whether it's social media, whether there's any dimension of information that sits around that? And then finally, what are your management processes and procedures? How do you red flag when things aren't running to tune? So if any of those fail, then you can result in a catastrophic failure of the crowd and develop some issues and problems. And then, of course, you look at the phases of behavior: ingress, circulation, and egress. So your design, information, and management applies to ingress, applies to circulation, applies to egress. And then finally, of course, you've got normal and emergency behaviors. So how somebody responds in a normal situation is going to be different to how they'll respond in an emergency situation. So always the filter of DIMICE modelling is to look at what can go wrong, how can it go wrong, where might a street become overloaded, how might we inform people to prevent that, how should we manage the situation. So it's looking always first at the design limitations. What are my physical constraints that I cannot change, my design?
Yeah.
Which is why I'm saying when we get up to the £150,000 projects, I'm designing. Yeah. So we're working usually with a fixed design, understand its limitations, and that might be direction of approach, it might be capacity, it might be throughput, it might just be the overall nature of the event, whether it's conflicted spaces or whether or not everybody's going to, say, like a concert. So conflicted spaces would be a football match, two opposing teams, I need to segregate.
Yeah.
Yeah. When everybody's going to the same thing, like a concert, there are no opposing teams. I don't need to police any
Correct.
groups apart from each other. So we look at spaces where there might be a conflict in an area as then having another design constraint. But I need to manage that. You know, I can't just erect a barrier in the middle of the road. I might need to use a line of police forces. So design information and management are always the core tools that we'd use in all of our projects at all levels to fundamentally quantify the system that we're dealing with. Yeah? Does that help?
Yeah, of course. Do you have examples of the projects that we described, the DIMICE model that you used?
Demise.
Demise. Oh, yeah.
Demise.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Good. Because if I describe the projects, it will be very useful to have the model.
Sure. For Murrayfield, it was the design of the 3 ingress systems. So they've got 3 separate major turnstile banks where the transport system approaches the turnstiles. By using the DIMICE principles, we could identify areas of immediate improvement. So where the design has a limitation, you might not be able to inform people, but you can certainly manage the queuing process. So in other words, if I try and illustrate it there, say we've got a queuing system like this and everybody's approaching in this direction.
Yeah.
And of course these turnstiles are going to be used. You know, you go to the nearest turnstile first. The queue starts to build up, but now I've blocked access to these turnstiles.
Yeah.
So I position crowd managers here, and instead of using the first turnstiles first, I push everybody down to the back turnstiles. The queue starts to build up, and I keep managing the queue. So I keep pushing people down the system.
Yeah.
That requires active management. It won't happen by itself. People will inherently use, in physics, we've got least energy. In crowds, we've got least effort.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind waiting an extra couple of minutes. I just don't want to walk an extra 10 yards. And because I can't see it, I don't know if they're open.
Yeah.
So design information and management, absolutely, that's how we fix the problem of the queuing system, which is going to have a bottom line improvement because we've got more people in the stadium for a longer period of time exposed to all the merchandising and marketing. So greater spending power, simply by increasing the dwell time by reducing the queuing time.
Okay.
Okay.
I've seen that you have some examples of the tables that you use, the different projects. Do you have those examples in a written table for the projects that we discussed, or not?
Probably better to do it in a generic form, because that's not client confidentiality. We can talk in generalities, but how much of an improvement they've got is, of course, is commercially sensitive to them. Like they don't like to give out the profitability of any merchandising stall because of the adverse publicity that can come from that.
Of course.
Oh, you're making so much money off of us, why blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
Of course, there's a relationship between the stadium. They don't make money off merchandising. They make money off of the merchandising buying a pitch. So they're selling the space, they're not selling the product.
Yeah.
So they're very sensitive about anything that might involve what their bottom line margins are on events. So it's best to maybe do that in a generic form rather than have any quantifiable form for any specific client. But in general, we get around about a 20% improvement in queuing efficiency. Again, we may be able to produce for you a generic model that shows type A against type B without being client specific.
Yes, that would be helpful. Yeah, for sure. So we cannot use any specific details about this project. Can we use the names?
I would seek permission, but I think that would be okay. That wouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
But again, I would just ask the client, we're writing a paper, this is what we're outlining on. And again, because I sign non-disclosure agreements with clients in all cases, they like it when we can produce something that says that they are brilliant and great.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and in this instance, what we will say is that there was, they called in the experts, there's an improvement to be made. but they're already at a gold standard. So I can sell it to them on that basis, provided we're not then not seen to be duplicitous. We're not telling them one thing but writing something else. Yeah.
Anyway, you're going to check the final draft, so you tell us if it's okay or not.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be a problem. I think in generic terms we can describe the details of any site, but the specifics about how much the profit margin is, I only got that on the basis that they gave me all of their sales figures and forecasts, that would never be disclosed. So
no, that's fine. Can you send me those generic details then? If you can put them in the tables that you have created and send them to me, will be much appreciated.
I shall have to construct something, but yes, I can do that.
Excellent. Also, can I have more information about your risk model? Or I think you described it in your book, am I right?
Yeah, which one are we talking about? Because they're all really risk models.
Sorry, the DMIs, did I say it correctly this time?
Demise.
Demise.
Demise, yeah?
Yeah.
Let's practice that. Demise.
Demise.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It's a market. It's trademarked. It's a marketable word.
Yeah. No, I know.
Should be able to roll off the tongue, and it should sound like death. Yeah, I mean, I can send you examples that have come out of various essays and essays that have used it, because each of our students. We can take people that have got years of field experience but no academic qualifications, and I then put them through a short training course. You've seen the online course.
Yeah, I did.
At the end of it, the 2 essays that they produce, we've now got well over 100 of those, all of which are to demonstrate the use of the Demise models for specific sites.
Okay, good. Excellent.
So what I'll do is I'll pick the best of those, the cream of the crop.
Good.
We've got that now about to be published in a book anyway. So they've been edited and checked. So I'll send you those chapters on crowd science and application of Demise models. How about that?
Excellent, yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Do you think it's worth for me to have access to your book? Is there any information that we can use from there?
From the new book or the existing
No,
one?
the existing one.
Again, we were specific to exclude anything that I'd signed NDA on, which is nearly all projects. And but yes, what I can do is get you. I have 10 very good papers that they've all waived the NDA, so I can get you those. So we've got the science papers and the generic application of the models papers.
Excellent. No, that's
so
really
for sites
perfect.
around the world, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Anything that you would like to suggest? Anything that any idea that you have about the paper, or you are happy with that?
My struggle has always been that, having done this for like 30 years, I problem solve rather than think about it from first principles. So it's difficult to disassociate myself with the skill set to try and understand how to write about it, because to me it's always felt like, oh, look at how wonderful I am, look at the problem I solved, look at what I did, and I just feel very uncomfortable in writing something like that. But what David said is, well, I should be, and that's where the benefit of somebody actually asking these kind of questions. I'd never have thought to ask those questions of myself. I go into a site like the Sydney Olympics, I go, it's an Euler tour and a Steiner shot, a spanning tree, here's a sketch. And people go, well, it's like magic. And I don't know where to get back to the roots of how to do that. It's just something I've done for nearly 3 decades. Half my life have been just doing this kind of stuff. I think the most common phrase is my father had a comment, says there's always 3 ways of doing things: the right way, the wrong way, and Keith's way. Because you look at a problem and you see something that no one else had seen before. Yeah. I can't describe that. But what we did was I developed, I'm using the royal we, what I did was develop a set of tools to try and explain some of that magic in layman's terms that then they could use it. So up to your 50 grand projects, yeah, I can teach that. Yeah. The bits that go when a client gives me a call on a site, I'll give you an example. Canada Day, they had Parliament building had very narrow gates and beautiful architectural wrought iron gates around it, and a big slope. So we've got a big slope and a gate at the bottom of the slope, and these have got barricades. They want to get 150,000 people in the site, but they've only got very, very narrow gates here with the big balustrade. And I said, well, why are you trying to get through the gates?
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, we can't destroy the architecture. I said, yeah, but you can just build a set of stairs over it. And they went, oh, no, we can't do that because then we can't protect the perimeter. And I said, well, no, you just extend the perimeter. And they said, well, we can't do that because that's Wellington Street. That's Ottawa's property.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, yes, you can. You can create an act of parliament that creates a temporary event site for the duration of that event. And they went, oh. So there we've gone from a physical design constraint to then being thinking about temporary event notification when I just make it part of the event site. And of course that required political thinking.
Yeah.
It required design thinking.
Yeah.
It required the management principles.
Mm-hmm.
But to me it was just bang, bang, bang. And, we were in a live class when they said, can't do that. And I said, yes, you can. This is how you solve it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but we can't do that. Yes, you can. This is how you solve it.
Yeah.
So it's understanding of politics. It's understanding of the local domain. It's doing your background research before you go to visit a client. You've done your research, your site, your problems, your issues.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at the queuing constraint. It's looking at how you can't possibly manage it within the space that you're dealing with. Therefore, you must find more space.
Yeah.
How do you do that? What are the rules? And they tend to be very compartmentalised in the rule set. So the people in Parliament said, oh, this is our territory. We can only deal within our territory. I said, no, you just make it bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that requires an act of Parliament. Yes, well, you are Parliament. Just pass a law that for the duration of your 150th anniversary, you make Wellington Street part of the parliamentary property, and then immediately the event finishes, it goes back to ownership of Ottawa.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a parliamentary policy that needed to be passed.
Mm-hmm.
But every time they have their annual event, they just increase the size of the space. So Wellington Street changes ownership for, I think, the 48-hour duration. And they went, oh, yes, of course, we're Parliament, we can do this. And I think that's your problem-solving skills. And I could cite chapter and verse where we go into things, and people get stuck because they can't think outside their little compartment, their mindset. Now, I don't know where that comes from. That's just the magic of I guess, maybe doing stuff like this, or maybe that's the way your brain's wired. But I'm not sure how easy to explain that as a generic skill that I can teach. It's just using and seeing so many events that you kind of figure out there are solutions to every problem. Mm-hmm. So long as you think a problem to solve rather than a problem that you can't overcome.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, that's a life philosophy.
Excellent.
Something different.
I think I have all the information I needed for the paper, and if you can send me the documents that we discussed, would be brilliant. And
so I've got on my list here, do a generic queuing design, which is a typical problem that we could show an optimized improvement for, that has been applied on, I think, at least a dozen sites that I've worked on. Mm-hmm. They have the same kind of issue where we've got the turnstiles like this, and people are approaching like that, and of course they're in training on that first queue rather than being managed, pushed down and using them all. So that's just showing an optimal efficiency against a directional approach to it for a queuing solution. That's relatively simple, straightforward. I'll draw an outline of how it'd be done, but then we might think about what level of maths you want to put in there, okay?
Yeah, excellent. No, that's fine. And the essays from...
the essays, that was the other thing. Send you examples.
Yeah, excellent. Very good.
Okay.
Now, we've got your case study that the Manchester Metropolitan needs.
Yeah.
They asked, what is the underpinning research here? So, do you have this document in front of you?
Yeah,
do you want me to send it to you?
You could send it to me if I don't have it at my fingertips. Yeah, why don't you send it through?
Let me see. Oops. No, that's me trying to send it. Okay, here we are. Do you have it?
Not yet.
Now you cannot see it?
Not quite, not yet. Maybe if I just bang on the computer a couple of seconds, sometimes the electrons need a little bit of a nudge.
I believe I said it to you.
I have no doubt that you have.
Oh dear.
Not quite come through. These things are never as instant as we want them to be.
I know. There's no magic on these machines.
So, case study. Are we talking about the CFE project, or which case study are we talking about?
Developing a global framework to mitigate the risk of crowd disaster in public spaces.
Oh, is this the one that Catherine Rycroft has been?
Correct.
Right.
And she has some questions. So, what is the underpinning research here? She says, which relates to 2014 book. So, what are the forces and dynamics at play here, which needs to be addressed? What is the problem?
The problem was loss of life and threat of litigation was the problem. Was that people were dying in large numbers in crowds, and it kicked off for me was Hillsborough. So 96 dead, several hundred injured in a massive problem with a queue in a fixed stadium. So if you're not familiar with it, there was mass fatalities, and I started to look into, at the time, what were the formulas for crowd flow and queuing. And during the early stage of my research, nobody had any answers. Even the building research establishment were using a formula which was based on fluid dynamics. So at that time, the only maths that were usable for crowds came out of John J. Fruin's book, Pedestrian Planning and Design, which talked about level of service at different densities, you did different flow rates. But the UK documents and guidance only had one flow rate and didn't mention it at all. So to me it was quite obvious there was a big gap between what was out there as understood and what was correct. So because I asked a whole bunch of questions and then developed some virtual reality simulations of crowds and said, look, if your formula is true, then this is what we should see, but we're seeing this. So I could apply in the virtual reality simulation the standard formula that they thought they understood about crowds, and also the formula that I created, which showed the crowd movement as being literally local optimization rather than a fluidic flow. Now, I kind of explain that. In terms of research, fluid dynamics and the Bernoulli formulas are based on the fact that each of these particles are interacting under hydrostatic forces, electrodynamic forces, and frictional forces. But crowds have choice. What the fluid models did not have was that a person at any position can decide to go in which he believed to be less effort. Whereas all of the physics models were least energy.
Yeah.
Now, least effort means that I can choose to step out of that queue and take a longer way around. So the dimension of choice needed to be added in to the physics models.
Yeah.
So that fundamentally was the breakthrough in terms of the research, was to realize that the physics models plus choice gave us a crowd, flock, shoal, anything where you see large conglomerates of thinking objects moving as opposed to non-thinking objects moving, was that there was this additional, and I think it called it assimilation, constraint, mobility, and something else. It's in my PhD. Is that there are 4 parameters that we needed to involve, whereas physics only had 3. So we needed to introduce that dimension of choice, and that by looking at all of the psychological parameters that people could choose, it really just came down to assimilation. Is that people take in information, they process it, and then they decide to go this way.
Yeah.
So how do we mimic that in terms of our modeling? So that was my simulation work, which was my PhD thesis, was to model a lowest possible set of rules, the smallest set of rules that could give me flocking behavior that didn't inherently contain a rule that said to flock. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Well, if you look at Boyd's models, get to the center of the mass is a flocking rule. And that creates flocks, realistic-looking flocks and shoals. So Craig Reynolds did all this research basically saying that you've got match speed, maintain a minimum distance, and then get to the center of the flock. So the thing was constantly flocking and shoaling. Crowds don't do that. They've got no perception of where the center of mass is. As people move through these spaces, their local heuristic is basically assimilation constraint, looking at what's constrained around them and trying to find the least effort that takes them to get from A to B. And it might mean I'll stand in a queue because I know it's getting there and I don't know what's happening at either side. So that really was the fundamental research, was to develop these core algorithms in the simulations, and from that then really it was if any of those core elements are missing, was there a causality for accidents? That's where the dim ice model came from, was building simulations of using the smallest set of calculable locally heuristic algorithms that gave me very realistic crowds that were, unlike a lot of the other tools out there at the time, I could create all of the behaviors I could see in the crowd using a very simplistic algorithm. So much so when I was doing my PSAT, my PhD research, I went into my professor. I don't know if you know of Ian Stewart, famous mathematician.
No,
Maybe
I don't know. No.
Okay, well, he's written hundreds of books on the topic. He's the Gresham Professor of Warwick University Maths. I went into him and I said, look, I've reduced this just to this simple algorithm. And I said, I'm really depressed because this is my entire PhD research, 7 years of work. And I'm on page of A4. I said, I can't write a thesis about this. And because there was my simple algorithm, it described crowds. And he got up from his desk and he walked around to his blackboard and he wrote E equals MC squared. And he says, how do you think that guy felt? So I looked at it and I went, well, having that fundamental understanding, the research had been able to distill human behavior into a simple heuristic that then each agent in the model had a simple heuristic, but it would create a wide range of behavioral tendencies. And all of that really was an influence of the environment.
Yeah.
So how you respond to a space depends on why you're there, who you're with, what's happening, what other people are doing around you, but it hasn't changed you. It's your environment that shapes what you tolerate.
Yeah.
So realizing that developing a set of tools that allow me to create an environmental substrate that the agents would read and write to give them collective responses, but without actually changing the heuristic on each agent. They became a product of their environment.
Okay.
That was my research.
Yeah.
And then proving that had all of the calibration models. That's my PhD. Was saying I can mimic all of the human behavior that we could see, and it still hasn't been disproven, with a very simple local heuristic. That then led me to think of, okay, when it goes wrong, what's happening is that not that the local heuristic is faulty, but the environment design, the environment, the information, or the environment I'm being told or managed against my natural tendencies were causing the algorithm, the heuristic, to break down. I think that that's your fundamental research that sits behind it, was then realizing that, okay, I've got this tool, the simulation, but I need to teach people not how to use the tool, but how to stop screwing with crowds to create the environment that would cause the problem. So fundamentally, I think the research just flipped on its head. Well, I know the causality. Now, what do I do to prevent it?
Yeah.
But I then shifted everything into education.
Good.
If I can teach people, and of course I was trying to teach them, here's the heuristic, here's the algorithm, and nobody understood.
Yeah, I understand.
So design information management. If you think of it like that, you can prevent accidents. And developing that up into then that's a surface of a catastrophe curve, and really what we're looking at, the cost catastrophe, is when these three elements combine in such a way as you can have a sudden massive change of state. That I explain in our third unit after a whole year of working them through the various models, and only 50% of our master students get it.
Okay.
So if you understand what I'm trying to say here, is the research was on the human behavior, the simulation of agents. The understanding of that then flipped my entire career around to how do I now teach at a different level causality and accidents in order to prevent them from happening. So not so much looking at the accident itself, but looking at the preventative measures that need to be put into place to prevent these incidents from occurring in the first place. Yeah.
To prevent the incidents and how to teach other people to prevent them as well. So this is what you tried to address.
Yeah, in essence, the research goal was to make the world a safer place, but the individual aims and objectives were, we don't have a vocabulary. We didn't have the language. And if you don't have a language, you can't describe something. So, to give you an instance, what is your nationality, Marina?
It's Greek.
Okay, so what is the word for safety in Greek?
It's asfalia.
What's the word for security in Greek?
It's the same.
Yes. So you don't have a differential in nearly every language in the world. Doesn't have a different word for safety and security.
Yeah.
But these are two very different concepts. So unless we've got a language that describes the vocabulary of safety, and if we only think in terms of the context of security, we had a conference where everybody was talking about counterterrorism, because the Israeli guy came across and was talking about weapons, because the word in Israeli for safety and security is the same word. But when we talk about safety, we talk about the inherent provision of a safe environment. Security is the hardening of external threats to prevent the external threat. So you need a different word, you need a different language, and that was the problem, was that nobody had that vocabulary yet. Hence, demais, hence the vocabulary that evolved from that, the risk and congestion mapping, the density and flow analysis. All of this was a realization that without having a vocabulary, a language, we could not communicate the core issues.
Okay.
So my research spun on its head as I said, I know what's causing it. Now, how do I prevent it? There is no language. There is no universal language that describes it. Only in English did we have safety and security as different concepts, and yet you looked at all of the event plans, and these were mashed together as one. So separating the concepts out first was the first step, is to create a vocabulary, create a language, to create the tools that then we can understand the framework of that language. And that's why nearly all of the tools you see have graphic elements to it. Because we're trying to eliminate the language in there. A risk and congestion mapping has no language. It's pictures. It can be understood French, German, Greek, Albanian, whatever. So the red, amber, green, the traffic light concept here was, how do I create a language of risk that would then allow us to instill these changes in people and for them to be able to understand it to the point of being able to use it. So I think if you want to look at research, it's linguistics. Is creating a language, a vocabulary that has traction, that people can easily understand and then utilize. There is no point in having a concept that is so difficult for people to understand they can't use it. And that's where I started with the agent-based algorithms. Nobody could understand what I was saying. You know, I think Ian Stewart wrote an article on this called "The Shadow of the Cobweb." The maths is a multi-dimensional deconstruction. It's a multi-dimensional problem projected from 3 dimensions down into 2, where we can visualize it. That story came about is that I was paralyzed from the waist down after an operation, and I saw a cobweb hanging from the roof, and I realized that the shadow it was projecting on 2 different walls from 2 different light sources was telling me something about the cobweb's construct, but not everything. So how much information did I need to know about crowds? Not everything. I need to know enough to keep it safe. So what is the smallest shadow projection? And that's the Demise model. I'll send you that article, actually. Ian explains it a lot better than I do.
Thank you.
So the research here really was, if you want the, let me just write this down. Linguistics. How to create a vocabulary. And that evolved over about a decade.
Okay, excellent. And how does your research address the problem? How did your research address the problem that you mentioned before, and you explained it?
It was teaching. It was in 1999 when I was working on the Olympics. I was researching for my PhD at the Emergency Planning College, and they said, could I come and teach there? And as you'll be well aware, there's a man getting undressed behind you. Just taking his shirt off, which appears to be in the bedroom. This is just getting weird.
I'm sorry.
I hope he's not your neighbour.
No, it's my husband who has just returned.
That's okay. Just tell him he's on camera just now. So, I was asked to teach, and of course, it's not until you try and teach something that you start to learn it. So what I had was this concept, and what I needed to do was teach people to use it, but I couldn't explain the concept. I had to figure out ways in which to explain things, and of course, I have now the history of how the teaching program has evolved. From starting off with things like center of gravity and looking at masses, looking at distributions and weighted means, and none of that survived because the language of mathematics is so alien to the people that operate in crowd space. So I needed to develop a vocabulary, a graphical representation was my solution. Was, well, we see or perceive a risk, we try to articulate it in words, we transmit the words, people then take the words and try to re-visualize the risk. Why can't we just go visual to visual? So how do I visualize risk? As dynamic. So these all evolved for the fact that I couldn't, it was very difficult for people to understand the mathematical language of risk. So it was a question of translating that into usable tools. So if you like, as I've often said, my research is based on how to best teach risk analysis. How to take what I know and turn it into useful tools and substances. And the best way of doing that is teach. People look at you and go, I didn't get that. Then figure out a better way of explaining it.
No, I understand completely. And how do you ensure your stakeholders, your students, I assume, benefit from it? It's because of the knowledge that you transfer.
Them come on the courses because they have problems that they can't articulate. And by giving them tools to articulate risk, He's just close to Captain now. Thank goodness.
Good.
It could have got very embarrassing very quickly here.
He understood. Okay.
Yeah. So by giving tools the student to articulate the risk, all of them come in the courses because they have problems. They all take with them the problem. So day 1 and 2 is here's the theory. Day 3 is right, let's work with you to apply it to your site.
Okay.
So they all gain instant benefit. They don't become masters of the trade, but they understand that there is a solution, and that's just pushing them on that first step. They then have the option of writing 2 essays. One is their understanding of the science of crowd dynamics, and the second is their case studies, the tools applied to their site. How do they solve the problems on their site using these tools? So that's the essays that I can give you. Real-life examples of DMIS applications.
Excellent. Now she asks, until these tools were developed, the tools that you have developed...
Your screen's just frozen.
Oh dear.
Hello?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello.
We lost Skype.
Hello?
No.
Hello? Can you
Don't
hear
know
me
what
now?
happened there. We lost connection.
I know, but we are back now.
Okay, where were we?
So it says now that you have created some tools, and crowd risk was evaluated using static metrics.
Hello again?
Hello. I don't know why we have this problem now.
Yeah, so we evaluated some tools and crowd risk was, and then it broke up.
And crowd risk was evaluated using static metrics.
That's right. So
She needs a brief description. She needs the scenario planning and numerical values.
Yeah, this is where I run into problems. The current guidance for risk assessment is non-structured, so you just think of a risk, you write it in a box, which is a table, a form. So our risk assessment forms generally have a likelihood and consequence matrix. So what's the likelihood of the risk, what's the consequences, generally in financial terms, of the risk. And the matrix is 1 to 5, 1 to 5. So the number might be 15. is then put in your risk analysis. And then you add all those numbers up and it gives you an overall risk of the site, which is nonsense because, of course, say 10 could be a product of a likelihood of 2 and a consequence of 5, or a likelihood of 5 and a consequence of 2. Well, one might be a £5,000 exposure, one might be a £5 million exposure, but both give you the value of 10. So the whole process that they based risk assessment was one static, a single value derived from a set of variables that were highly subjective. And two, you then couple that with a brief description, which doesn't give you enough information to deconstruct or reprocess the risk. So it's Shannon's information theory. Claude Shannon in 1949 wrote the details about information theory, which is basically I take information, I condense it, transmit it, and then somebody has to deconstruct it without any loss of information. So the person that's writing the risk assessment might have visualized the risk, written down a couple of words, assigned a number, and it's impossible for then me to reconstruct that risk from that information. So what happens is person A has an experiential learning, writes his risk assessment. Person B might have a different set of experiences and interprets that risk assessment from his own perspective. So it's not only lossy, it might not actually have any bearing on the risk itself. And fundamentally, because it takes a long time to write these things out and they're unstructured, person B doesn't read and understand it, and therefore the risks don't ever get managed. So the whole process was static, lossy, had one value to define an entire event. So if we take, say, the risk of a trip, slip and fall, it's high during ingress in a specific location. It's then zero. There's nobody moving through that area. There's nobody at the ingress points during the event. And they may go out through another gate. So it remains at zero. So it starts high and drops to nothing. But then other areas of the site, the risks of trip, slip and fall, say at front of stage or in a concession stand or on a slope in the rain, but all we have is slip, trip and fall and a number. So it doesn't describe the site, doesn't describe the location, doesn't describe the solution, give you enough information to process it. So the current documentation has nothing that really is useful, helpful, but it's a compulsory legal requirement to do a risk assessment in this format. So when I looked at it, I went, okay, most of the events industry use a 0-hour contract, very low paid, and the majority of people that work events are maybe not native English speakers. So I wouldn't say immigrants, I'm trying to find a better word, or low-paid workers from overseas. So you find a lot of people that work at major events don't have English as the first language, so can't read it anyway. Now, I'll give you an example of that. I was on a cruise ship watching the safety briefings for the majority of the people that worked on cruise ships are Filipino. And they were given a safety briefing, which was in English, and had all of the details about muster stations and assembly points and, you know, what the calls were, etc. And everybody nodded their head. Yeah, okay. Do you understand that? Yeah. And I asked them afterwards, how many speak English? None.
Okay.
But they know when to nod their heads. So here's the problem, is that information needs to be given, received, information given, transmitted, received, understood, and acted upon.
Correct.
So it's Shannon's information theory, and this clearly was given, was received, but not understood. So it did not propagate. So our whole risk assessment process is based on the assumption that the information is complete, that it is it's able to be reconstructed from a static value, a number, into a dynamic situation, which requires, of course, the receiver to have the experience of all of the overlay of the dynamics of that site in order to understand and then act upon it, because your risk assessment is a precursor to risk management. I have a risk, now I need to manage it.
Yeah.
You have a young child, you have a fire. You know the fire is a risk, you need to manage because the child does not know that fire is a risk.
Correct.
So I need to manage the process. So a risk assessment, fire might have a huge consequence, irreparable damage to a child. That means nothing. How do I stop the child from getting there is risk management. So, barriers need to be put up, information, you need to educate. There's a whole process around the risk. And that, again, was really deficient in our current processes worldwide. Because, of course, it's a very quick thing to write down a couple of words and bang a number onto it. It's a very complicated thing to then manage those risks. But if you look at accidents and incidents, A, the risk was never understood, B, it was never transmitted, and C, it wasn't acted upon. So risk management really is where we come into play. And again, these tools help you better describe risk, better manage risk is the consequence that comes out of it.
Okay.
So the more we understand the risks, the more we can communicate those risks, the better the receiver has in managing those risks without having to add their own interpretation on it.
Okay. And
In terms of, in one paragraph, I don't know how to do that in one paragraph.
I'll find out. And one final thing. It says here that you have been providing the expert witness evidence on a number of high-profile litigation cases around crowd safety.
Yeah.
Specifically, what does it entails?
Well, this comes back to the first question. It means me looking at the risk assessment and saying they didn't understand the risk, they didn't communicate the risk, they didn't manage the risk. As a consequence, and I'll put it in our analogy, you knew the fire was a risk, you did nothing to prevent your child getting near that fire, the child was burnt, you are responsible for that child.
Yeah.
Therefore, the litigation would be against you. And I don't mean any disrespect by that.
Yeah, no.
The owner needs to provide a risk assessment. He needs to manage those risks. Failing to do so, if somebody results in consequential death or injury, means that the owner has failed under UK law. There is an inbuilt duty of care. Different countries have different definitions of those laws. So it's understanding the legal implication, understanding the risk management processes, looking at the documentation and looking at the CCTV footage to see whether they had, back to Murrayfield, they know they've got a risk, they know they're doing something faulty, he hasn't been able to put his finger on it, he asked me to go and have a look at it, therefore he can prevent an accident as a consequence of not properly managing those risks. It was documented, but they didn't manage it. So Greenvale, 3 kids died in a nightclub queue. The risk assessment was poor. The staff weren't trained. They had cameras, they didn't use them, and a whole list of failures to manage those risks. So he didn't document it, he didn't manage it, so A, B, and C failed. So the litigation here is looking at their risk management processes. In all cases, it's about how did they understand and manage those risks, or their failure to do so resulting in subsequent harm. And then being able to write that in a legal language. Again, my reports, unlike all the other experts there's always an expert for the other side. All the other experts try to describe it in words. I show it in pictures, which is why we're winning a lot more cases than we're the opponents. Because the pictures are, the jury are lay people. They're not experts.
Yeah.
They call the experts in to explain it to a layperson. So my vocabulary, my pictorial format, my simplistic way of taking something complicated and turning it into something that's relatable, which is why seeing the child's chair at the back, I would use the example of a child for you because I know that you can directly relate
of course
that experience and map that to, I'm now a stadium manager, I've got 50,000 people coming to my stadium. What are the risks for that children under my command and control?
Good.
So it's always thinking about the crowd of, if they can do something stupid and crazy, they will. And a child, and again, our vocabulary comes into play here. I don't know, do you talk to your children in Greek or English?
in Greek.
Okay, so the syntax might be different, but in English we would say, if a child's reaching for a fire, don't touch the fire. And the imperative, the don't, comes before the instruction.
Yeah.
What the child hears is don't, and then touch the fire as a command.
Okay.
So this is why you say, why do children always do what you tell them not to? It's because your language is negated. The way in which our syntax is set up is so poor. We shout the instruction, which only gets their attention, and then we give them, in a rather stern voice, touch the fire, which is exactly what they do. They're following your instructions. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I do.
So it's vocabulary, it's language again. The syntax, if you like, of how we construct sentences. Another example would be for persistent standing. The message goes out, do not stand. And of course, to a certain group of individuals at football matches, it's like, well, who are you to tell me what to do? So we said, your language should be, sit down and enjoy the match.
Okay.
So you're giving them a clearer syntax.
Yeah.
And a whole body of research about the language that we use. And I'm not a linguistic. I don't talk other languages. So I find it very difficult to understand how the different syntaxes come about. But in essence, it seems to be a very similar problem, is that our language of vocabulary is so poor. And if you like, all of my work really is how do I take that bias out of the language, and how do I turn the information that I need to transmit into easier, usable formats? So it's the language of mathematics, it's pictures, it's diagrams.
Yeah, no, I understand. She continues with that and says that what type of tools you have developed to interpret certain complex data.
Well, again, that's trying to represent using a risk map, for instance. I have a map for ingress, a map for circulation, a map for egress. I use red, amber, green. It's very difficult to describe that in words, so which is why it's had a universal adoption. But people saying, well, why haven't we done this before? Why aren't we using this? It's because you were told to write it in a format, rather than thinking, what's the objective here is to communicate my perception of risk to the group that are managing those risks. So why are we forced to use a tool that doesn't work? Okay. So again, it's using the visuals here. It's turning something complicated into something that's easy to understand. And if you like, I mean, having explained it to you, it's the I think my research really is linguistics, is methods of communication, if you like. All the teaching has been a learning curve for me, is that if I try to explain something and the class don't get it, then I've not explained it properly. How do I figure out better ways of explaining complexity in a way that will influence and change risk and risk management?
No, I understand. All right. I think that's it, and thank you very much for your time, your information. It was very helpful. And hopefully we will have a good draft at the end of this month of the paper.
Thank you very much for all your work and effort.
And I will send the information to what's her name? I can't remember. Catherine, or what's her name?
Catherine, yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's it. Yeah.
Excellent. If you can distill that into one paragraph, brilliant. I found it very difficult.
I'll try my best.
Anyway, thank you so much.
I hope to see you at the university sometime, and we'll meet face to face.
Are you in Manchester just now then?
I'm in Manchester, yeah.
This is your home in Manchester?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, well, I live about an hour north in the Lake District.
I live in Didsbury.
All right, but when I try to get to Manchester, I seem to be, for the last 4 years, the same roadworks. And now, for the last 2 years, a new set of roadworks. And the last time I was down there, a third set of roadworks. So every shortcut I have to get into Manchester now is now blocked.
Oh, dear.
2 hours to get to the university, whether it's by train or by car, which is just too much time out of a day. 2 hours there, 2 hours back.
It's a waste of time.
It is when we've got technology like this.
Yeah, excellent.
Real pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Me too. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Wow.